Hi, it's Troy Griggs with Obsidian Wisdom. I'm thankful for another Retirement Readiness Thursday. Today, we're going to discuss a 10-year roadmap. If you're someone that's considering retiring in the next 10 years, there is a lot of time that we feel we have. But if you think about it, those 10 years do go by pretty quickly. I know, let me turn on that. I know for me personally, right? I'm sitting here, my youngest child is 8 turning 9. And if you asked me, Dre, does it feel like it's been 10 years since you were changing diapers? And I would say, no, it has not. Feel like it's been 10 years since I've been changing diapers. If you even think about something like COVID, it feels like it was yesterday. And yet, COVID is almost like 5 years ago now, where time really just kind of keeps moving. And even though the days maybe feel long, sometimes the week even, but when you look at the months and the years, it goes by pretty quickly. And I know when I had just graduated from FSU in 2003, no, I went in 2003, graduated in 2007. And then that was like right around the Great Recession. And I was like, man, this is really tough. And I was trying to figure out how to get my income right because I started in a depressed market. If you start working in a recession, well, there's a lot of people unemployed. So I had an entry level job I was applying for, and there were people with doctorate degrees and multiple years of experience applying for the same jobs. So that became a employer's market. And then you know that sometimes it shifts where it becomes an employee's market where they're offering you benefits and vacation and a turkey on Thanksgiving. And they're offering all this stuff because it's so hard to get good talent. So we know that the time just kind of keeps moving. I don't want that to happen to you when we're talking about retirement. So today we're going to go over a handful of things that I would be checking off my list if I was putting a plan in place to ensure that when I was looking at retiring in the next 10 years, that everything was probably as good as it possibly could be. If there's any questions that you have along the way, of course, place them in the chat. We'll go over them, but we'll go through a variety of different strategies. And first, it makes sense to start with the idea of our savings and maximizing our savings. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to share for you a very easy screen. And what you'll be able to see is this idea that, well, if I'm working towards retirement, how much of my money should I have being generated from my investments, right? Like that's a very simple way to look at it. And so I'm going to share my screen with you. And what we'll see is the idea is when we're 30, you want to have about a core, about half of, well, about like half of your income saved in your salary. So if you're making $50,000 a year in your 30s, you want to be somewhere around 25% of that 50,000 would be saved. That if you're making 40,000, you want to have about 20,000, right? These are just different averages. It's not to say that you have to have it, but it's just to be aware of the number, just to have a general idea. And then if you're 35, you want to have about 1 times to 1.5 times your salary. So the same idea, if we have $50,000 a year that was being made, then we want to have 50,000 to $75,000 that would be set aside for my retirement. Let me zoom in a little bit for you. So when you're 40, you want to be around 1.5 to 2.5 times. And then you see 45, you want to be 2.5 to 4 times your salary. And then around 50, you really want to be close to 3.5 to 5 times your salary. This is what we're talking about, just saved in investments. Now, if your 30s were kind of like family, I had a mortgage, I had cars, I had student loans, then it's most likely that we weren't able to get that started. And that's why one of the cool things that we do have is called catch up provisions. It's a very fancy way of saying that once we're over 50, we have the ability to add more money than our normal allowance. And so, what we'll do, and I will share with you some of those catch up provisions. And so, let me go to my whiteboard so I can write some of those provisions for you. And so let me see how I can remove this. And then I want to change it. All right, perfect. There it is right there. So we're going to share this tab. All right. So when you're talking about your catch-up provisions, this is the idea that I know I'm behind. I had life, I had situations, I had debt, I had children, I had whatever was going on. Maybe I had to restart my career. Whatever we had, we know that it didn't work out just the way as planned. So there's a few things. So first we'll start with your normal, so inside your 401k, your 403b, so I'll list these. So inside of like your 401k, right, that's supposed to be like that. Your 403b, you probably could find these also inside of your 457 plans. in your TSP plans. So currently in 2025, you are able to contribute 23,500 bucks, right? So that's how it's normally said, 23,500. You can place that in pre-tax accounts. Means the money is not taxed today, it goes in tax deductible. Doesn't even count as income today. The money then grows tax deferred. So I don't pay taxes each year as I'm growing in this account, but it is taxed as ordinary income when I take the money out in retirement. So if I'm able to do that, we have this catch-up provision. So once you are 50 or older, you can take out another. Oh, let me actually clean that up a little bit. You can take out another 7,500 bucks, right? So there we go. So you can take out another 7,500 bucks, which means you can place in your 401k, 403b, 457 or TSP or other pre-tax accounts $31,000. So you have this catch-up provision. This is to make up for the earlier years when life kind of got in the way. Uncle Sam said, no problem. I don't want you to have to use Social Security as your main form of income. I'm going to incentivize you to be able to put even more money inside of your pre-tax account. Now, inside of the Secure Act 2.0, they actually added something called the super catch-up provision. And so what that is when we are around 60 to 63, we can actually put even more money contributed towards that. And so you can contribute up to 11,250 instead of the 7,500. So you could add an additional 11,250. So Uncle Sam understands the numbers just like the rest of us. Life happens, we have bills, we have mortgages, we have cars, we have student loans, we have kids scholarships, sports teams, we have life. That sometimes means that we fell behind of what those general numbers are. High level, ideally, if we're halfway towards retirement, we want half of our income to be able to be generated from our money working and half of our income generated from us working. But as we just went over, life does happen. So you do have that catch up provision. If you're talking about your IRA or your Roth IRA, so when I say IRA, I'm talking about your traditional IRA, the pre tax one. So I'll just add traditional here in the front. Normally, you can contribute $7,000 a year into your IRA. You have the catch up provision once you're 50 plus of an additional $1,000. So you can contribute $8,000. It's always important to mention that this number is split between the two accounts. You cannot put $8,000 into a traditional IRA and then put $8,000 into a Roth IRA. You can only put $8,000 combined between the two accounts. So if you put $4,000 in a traditional, then you could only put $4,000 into a Roth. If you put $8,000 into a Roth, then you put $0 into your traditional. That between the two of them, it's only 8,000 is what you're able to put in. In high level, right, what we normally would say is if I am someone who believes I'll be taxed more in retirement, then I would like to pay my taxes today. So I'm not going to defer my taxes in retirement if I believe I'm going to be taxed more in retirement. So normally you would lean towards your after tax investments, whether you're a taxable brokerage account, that's just your regular business, that could be real estate, or it could be the regular stock market. If I believe that my taxes in the future will be lower, so that would be someone that is saying, you know what, I have a lot of income now. I have a great cushy position. My job pays a lot. When I retire, it's going to be a very simple life, Dre. I'm just going to relax, sit with a nice book, go on walks, hang out in the neighborhood. I don't see myself needing a lot of money in my retirement. If you're someone that falls in that bucket, then it normally makes sense to go ahead and defer your taxes. So you will lean towards the pre-tax account. That would be the way you would lean for that particular decision. Now, of course, there's a variety of other things that can go into that decision, but we're simply saying high level that that is what we will be thinking about. When you're talking about increasing or how much you would want to invest, so what we're thinking about is, all right, I need to know what my budget is. And so I do have a case study for you, and I will share this with you. All right. So this is Tony and Destiny. So we can see in their current lifestyle, right? They have about 15,000 in the bank. You can see that they also have, let me zoom in a little bit for you. It's about 26,500 in credit cards. So you can see that there's like 5, 6 credit cards. Then we can see that we have investments split between the two of them. So we have the 401k investments, we have some Roth investments for both of them where they're able to do some contributions inside of their 401k. And then they have the loans, which is mostly the mortgage and I believe a car. And then you have the property value still around 350. So that's what they have left. So that gives them a net worth where you take all the assets and then you subtract the liabilities, you give a positive to the assets. They're around $1 million as far as their assets. When it comes to their expenses in retirement, we're expecting it to be about $6,000 a month. So you would want to put a budget together. There's a couple ways you can go about doing this. Sometimes if we just know what the number is, hey, look, I have this much money come in, this is how much I have left, and then we can come up with the number. Sometimes if you're like, hey, you know what, I'm not 100% sure, I would like to actually get a feel for this. Sure, great, no problem. Normally what we would do is we would just put together a very simple spreadsheet. This is an example of what one could look like. We will look at what you spend on a month on your automobile and transportation, your bills and utilities. If you have any business, charitable giving, eating out at restaurants versus education if you're paying student loans back, entertainment, fees, gifts, groceries, fitness, these are high level categories. And then we would, any miscellaneous, just, you know what, I don't know where that money goes, but it seems like it goes somewhere. That we have these one-off things that we do as a family, whatever that looks like, we would have here in the uncategorized. And so that then allows us to be able to say, all right, this is roughly what my expenses will be now. And then we would look at what it would be in retirement. So we could say, well, obviously you contribute whatever 10, 15, 20% towards your retirement account. Naturally, when you're retired, you don't need to contribute that. So that's technically an expense. That's why for a lot of people, we say you just need to have about 80% of your income set aside because 20% of it is normally what you've been allocating towards your investments. Most of us aren't actually receiving 100% of our income anyways. And so that's why we normally will say the 80%. But you would go through that, you'd come up with your debt, we look at what the income is, and then we're able to decide how much money we need. There are a few approaches that you can take. And before I show that to you, I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page, that this is making sense to you. So if you have any questions along the way, or just give me a thumbs up, let me know that we're doing good. So normally when you're talking about the withdrawal strategy, how much income I need, there's a couple of approaches. One is people just will say, hey, I'm going to live off of 4% and I'm going to give myself a nice easy number. So I'm going to go ahead and share that. So I can give myself a nice easy number. Let's say we have $1 million in our account. If I'm going to live off of 4%, then that would be $40,000. So I'm going to live off my $40,000 a year. I would then add in my Social Security. Social Security, you would have to go on the website to see what the amount is, and it just takes a certain number of years, and you have to have the credits and all the calculations. But the good news is you could just go on the website, ask them for the number. But I can say on average, it's about $2,000 a month. That's what the average Social Security payment is. I rounded up, it's closer to like 1,800 and some change, but that's what the average Social Security payment is. So if we did the $2,000 a month, that'll be another 22,000. So we would have $62,000 that would be set aside. That could be your withdrawal strategy. And then we would have to say, all right, well, I'm looking at my expenses. I said my expenses at the time, remember we said that we thought our expenses would be $6,000 a month. So that would give us 72,000. So we would be $10,000 short. Right. So we're on our 10-year plan, just looking roughly kind of where you're at. You would say, all right, we need to make sure that we're able to generate another $10,000 by the time I'm looking to retire. Or we would have to look at pulling another lever, which is decreasing your expenses. If we're able to decrease your expenses, then you don't need the extra money, right? So we would go through and we figure out what those numbers ultimately look like. Now, one approach that I do like a lot, and it varies, it depends on, each situation. I enjoy the 3 bucket strategy. And the reason I like the three bucket strategy is because it gives us a little bit of flexibility when it comes to a volatile market, which, right, no surprise, we're in a little bit of volatility right now. But it also allows us to keep our money in the market. I want to be able to keep my money invested. To me, that's pretty important. I don't want to be so conservative, so cautious that I'm not even giving my money the chance to grow because I want my money to work for me. But we're not being so aggressive that we're losing money, right? So Warren Buffett says, like, rule number one, don't lose your money, and rule number two, don't forget rule number one. It's something like that. Now, granted, obviously losses happen, but we want to be able to protect ourselves from that. And we'll go over that a little bit more in this live as well, where we'll talk about some investment approaches that you can take. So on the first bucket, this is normally going to be 1 to 2 years of living expenses. So this is going to be our conservative bucket. And this will be your cash and cash equivalent. So your cash, your CDs, your money market accounts. I'm trying to think. Is there really anything else? I mean, for the most part, that's what that would be, right? Anything that's a cash and cash equivalent. It could just be money that's sitting in a savings account. Well, but that's cash. So we covered it. We're good. So that's my 2 years of living expenses. As long as I have my 2 years set up, that gives you a lot more comfort, right? Even in this current environment, do you believe that's going to be 2 years of this? And I would say most of us would probably say no. However the chips fall, whether you think that Trump's plan is the best plan ever, best thing since sliced bread, then you're going to be in 2 years. Then it probably it would be done. Everything would have been achieved. Rainbows and Skittles, everything is great. If you're on the other end and you think, well, this is going to destroy everything, right? Like this is going to be the worst thing ever. Then in 2 years, he's probably going to lose control of Congress, and then he's not going to be able to pass much more legislation and things of that nature. Right. So either way, in 2 years, if you give yourself 2 years of runway, there should have been enough of a change that you feel a little bit better about your situation. Normally, in our moderate bucket is going to be our income equivalents, things that is generating my income for me. And this will normally be 3 to, let's say, like 7 or 8 years. Let's just say 8 years. So 3 to 8 years. If I'm focusing on 3 to 8 years, then this could be everything from like a balanced mutual fund. When I say balanced, it means half of it's in bonds, half of it's in stocks. But blue chip, very conservative, well, very large, stable companies. Blue chip normally means the company's been around for like 50, 100 years. And more than not, that company is probably over $10 billion. Right. So very stable companies. If these companies go away, we're all in trouble, super big trouble. Now, of course, you could just be in just bonds. And remember, bonds just means debt. It's just the debt of a company. You have corporate bonds, that's corporation's debt. The good news of corporate debt is you get paid like a creditor. So if they borrow your money and they have a great idea and the idea for some reason falls flat, well, it's okay. You didn't invest in the growth, you just gave them the money. So they're going to give you the interest payment either way. They're going to pay you just like debt. The downside is naturally, if it was the best idea and they generate literally trillions of dollars, printing money hand over fist, you still just get the interest back of your payment. You're not an equity holder. You don't own the stocks of the company, so you don't get to participate in the growth. So that's the trade-off. And then naturally we have high yield, which I hate the name because it's junk bonds. That's what we used to call them. We used to call them junk bonds, which means it's junk. These are bad credit businesses that have a history of not paying their bills. And you giving them money with the promise of them paying you back is a junk bond. So we call them high yield because naturally, if someone has bad credit, would they have higher or lower credit than someone who has great credit? You're right. They would have much higher credit. The lowest rates would be what we would consider grade A bonds. So that would be corporations that always pay the bills on time, pay them early, phenomenal companies. Well, they get the lowest interest rates. So that would be the safest investments. And then junk bonds, they get the highest interest rate because they don't pay the bills on time. I should be compensated for my risk. So normally bonds would be there. And then for some of you, if you have an annuity, this is where I would consider it. Right? It's an income stream, it's moderate. I have some cash, but it's a bank. It's sort of an insurance, right? It's in that safe area, but it's not as safe as cash and liquidity. There are some rules on how you get the money out and things like that. So normally that would be roughly my moderate bucket. And then of course your last one is going to be your aggressive bucket. So aggressive bucket will be anything that's 10 plus And we're going for growth. This is all about growth. So no matter what happens, I'm leaving something in the growth. And I'm going to leave it there because I know it's going to grow. And it's not that it has to happen this same month or this same year. I've given myself a lot of runway. I give myself at least 1 to 2 years of cash, which gives me enough time for my bonds and balanced mutual funds to recover. And then if I sell for my balanced bonds and mutual funds to replenish my cash, I still have this where I can allow it to happen for literally almost 10 years. That's how much runway I've given myself, which allows you to stay aggressive comfortably. So we would be our business. This would be any type of stocks. We could be aggressive if we would like. This would be real estate. You can have commodities. So you can have like gold and things like that. Anything that we would consider aggressive. For me, when I say the word aggressive, I mean that it could go to zero. It's not that it's very likely to go to zero, but it can go to zero. That's what I consider aggressive. If something is aggressive, I need to give myself enough time for that to recover, right? So if you, for example, you're retired right now and you just saw that $6 trillion with a T left the stock market, you don't want to sell any of these right now. Well, you have to have some sort of investment strategy that allows you, right? If you just take out the 4%, wherever the money's at, you have to take out the 4%, right? You don't really have a lot of flexibility. But if you have this, you can say, you know what? Turn off the faucet. I'm just going to focus on my bonds and I'm just going to focus on my cash. In fact, you could decide, I'm not going to do anything with my moderate or my aggressive bucket. I'm just going to focus on my cash. When you're 10 years out, you get to start moving your money around to give yourself that protection where you can have this idea that's set up. And then as we get closer, we change the allocation. So if I'm 50, I might say, let's have 50% here. And then I would probably, and everybody's a little different, but I would say, let's say 20% here and 30% here. Right. So that way I have 50% that's still aggressive. I still have 20% that's in the moderate bucket, and then I have 30% in cash. Right. So I can do that. And probably at 50, I could do that. And then I would change these numbers around as I get closer to retirement. So I may, at 55, maybe this number drops down to 40. And then this number, I split it, but I probably wouldn't. I probably would just leave it like, and then I would increase that to 30, and then I would still leave this at 30. I wouldn't move more of it to cash. I mean, I wouldn't. Everybody's obviously different, your own risk tolerance, things like that. And then at some point you want to get to where it's like, that's where I'm staying at. I still need my money to keep up with inflation. I still need to be able to keep my purchasing power, especially if you're thinking about the possibility of slightly higher prices with tariffs. It's not that there's not the ability for there to be more American manufacturing. There's not the ability for there to be more jobs and small business and things like that. But if you're retired, you don't get the bump of people getting their payment increases, right? Like if you're increasing in salary, but you're retired, you don't get that half of the economy. You get just the higher cost half. And so you want to make sure that you have a portion of your allocation set aside to be able to account for that. And so you do want to be able to kind of keep that in mind. Naturally, if you're invested also and everything's going on, that would mean generally speaking, the S&P 500 should go up. Right? Like if you're like, hey, look, Dre, I believe this is going to be great. Okay. If it's going to be great, then how do we participate in the greatness? And I would say, well, if you're going to be retired, it's not going to be through your job income. It's going to be through your investments in the domestic market. Domestic just means U.S. companies. S&P 500 is going to be phenomenal companies. They're going to be U.S. companies. And so you would need to have a certain amount allocated towards that so that you can take advantage of that growth to then afford your retirement lifestyle. Hopefully that is making sense for you. All right, let's see if this is not making sense. Let me see if we have any questions. Ronald, how are you, my friend? Okay, so Ron says, which bucket would real estate equity might neatly fit into? Excellent question. So a lot of people, it really does depend. But for me, I put real estate in the aggressive bucket. So whether you're investing in actual real estate where you're taking, what I would do is like, if I own the real estate, right? If I own the real estate and I'm getting, let's say I'm getting $1,000 a month in rental income, you would then decide based off of that, where do I reallocate that money? And I would most likely say, depending on your age, You're either going to allocate it in your moderate bucket or you're going to allocate it into cash. And so what it does is it allows you to start realizing some of those gains, some of the investments where, I mean, we all know in the stock market, the money is there, our net worth is there, but we don't realize it until we sell the stock. And so that could be good. If the market goes down, it's okay. I haven't sold anything, so the loss isn't locked in. But then it could be, whatever, I don't know, less than good. If we haven't sold anything, then it's like a liquid net worth. But if I'm able to take some of the income that my real estate is generating and move that into a cash or a CD or a money market account, one is it's obviously replenishing my cash bucket so I can leave everything else. I can leave my real estate growing, I can leave my income streams growing, and then I'm able to replenish my cash bucket, realizing the gains. If you're in a, zoom it out a little bit. If you're in a REIT, real estate investment trust, so that's in the stock market, REITs give a significant amount of income out. I believe the number is like 80, 90% of the income a REIT generates. They have to give it to the shareholders to be able to maintain their tax preferential status. The way Uncle Sam treats anything from your income in your REITs, it is taxed as income. It has a different tax consideration. When you sell your normal stocks, that is going to be capital gains if it's a year and a day. But your REITs is still income. The cool thing about REITs is if someone owns, like let's say the company that owns all the malls, right? So you may say, well, Dre, no one cares about malls. I get it. Just work with me. If you're someone that is like, hey, I own all the malls and we charge $10,000 to every single person, we generate millions of dollars every year, would you like in on this opportunity? We have apartment complexes. It's in Miami, it's in New York, it's in California. We generate lots of income. We have 100 units, things like that. Would you like in on this opportunity? And then they say, great. Depending on how many shares you bought of that REIT, that is how the income is then divvied out to you. Whatever your percentage share is, that's the percentage that you receive. A REIT is considered a pass-through entity. I would probably still put the REIT, when talking about individual stocks, I would still probably consider them in the aggressive. And then when you get the income, you have two choices. You can do what's called a drip, which is like automatically reinvested into it. So you just kind of keep reinvesting the money. Or you can obviously take the income and then it'll be the same choice. Am I going to move it into my moderate bucket or am I going to move it into my safe bucket? You get that choice with that income stream. All right, so hopefully that answers your question for you, Ron. All right, so after you have that set aside, so we've already gone through a couple of them. Let me make sure my list is good. So with the maximizing your savings and then optimizing your investments, let me give you an example from this case study. So these are called model portfolios. Again, there are so many ways to set up the allocations. I do like generally showing the permanent portfolio because the permanent portfolio is a very simple allocation that shows how we're able to allocate in a way that allows us to be protected in a variety of economic climates. And that's ultimately what diversification is. Diversification is, I don't know what's going to happen in the future. The risk of the unknown, let me protect myself by covering my bases. And so while this may not be an allocation that I would use at 50, I do think it shows the benefit of diversification. So you can see that this particular asset allocation, you have 25% in the stock market, 25% in long-term bonds, 25% in cash, and 25% in gold. The reason this allocation is done this way is because the stock market is doing well in times of economic growth and prosperity. You can see that during a recession, we normally have our money sitting in cash because the stock market is going down. Stock market is going down right now, right? So where people are like, oh, is there a recession coming? You have your money sitting on the sidelines in cash. You have a percentage already that way. When you have times of inflation, people feel like every time I get my money, it's literally losing value. The price of everything is going up. It's like my money isn't holding its value. When people feel that way, where do they put their money? Well, you're right. If I'm concerned that my money isn't holding its value, naturally you put your money in things like gold. Hey, look, I'm going to put my money in something that does hold its value. I don't want my money to keep losing to inflation where it just keeps being trickled away. And then deflation is right the opposite. If I feel really good about the dollar, then I'm going to invest in long-term debt, long-term treasuries. And so that could be anywhere from normally 10, 20, 30 years is what we consider long-term treasuries. So anything over 10 years we normally consider long terms. So we have times of deflation that have long-term treasuries. As you can see, these are basically going to be the four high-level economic environments that you're going to be in. And you have an asset that performs well in every economic environment, which is the idea behind diversification. The idea is I don't know when these opportunities are going to happen. I don't know when these catastrophes are going to happen. So I have to have already set up an allocation that performs well in each of these climates. So as we move through them, I have a portion that's doing well. Now, again, this one is definitely more on the conservative end. So this probably wouldn't be one that we would start at 50, but it is the idea that that's what diversification ultimately is. And so you can see here in this particular allocation, we had more of the 60-40 approach based on their risk and their risk tolerance and the numbers that they need. So we have 40% in the stock market. We also have 15% in international markets, emerging markets. We still have a little bit of opportunity there. And then you have the real estate, the US bonds, and the international bonds, and then 6% in cash. So that would give us the 60-40 allocation. Historically speaking, that has been an 8% return is what it averaged. That's what this number is. And then when you see standard deviation, what we're saying is there is a possibility that this particular allocation could generate you 18%, right? So 10.2 plus the 8.2, so 18%. But it's also a possibility that this portfolio could lose you 2%, right? And so that's the standard deviation. We're saying that's the variance, that's the range. So you could lose 2%, you can gain 18%. So on average, it's 8%. And so that's how you would read that. I'm not saying you get 8% every single year. I'm saying that on average, over the life of this investment approach, you'd have about 8% returns, what you would expect. And then naturally things happen. And so we would look at that. That then naturally leads to the question of, all right, well, if that's what happens, kind of what's the idea of ensuring that I don't mess it up, right? I don't want to mess it up. And we normally will tell people rebalancing is the approach that you would take. So let me give you an example of what rebalancing would look like, and I'll show you what we would do. So we would do the rebalancing, or if you're doing this on your own, you would do the rebalancing. It takes the emotion out of investing, because what we end up having is we get FOMO, and we really are trying to be like, oh my gosh, do you see that stock is just going up and up and up? NVIDIA is probably a recent one of that. Every time you look, the video is going up. You're like, man, am I missing out? And like, ooh, should I? No, I don't know. Well, what ends up happening is you end up buying high. You end up buying a video at the highest amount, and then it may start going down. And then you're feeling like, oh, it's over. It was too good to be true. I knew it was. And you talk yourself, and then you sell it, which is selling low. And naturally, that's the opposite of what we want. We end up losing our money. So when you are doing a rebalancing, that removes emotion. So let's just say we have the 60-40. So we have that 60 and 40%. We're just going to make it easy. I'm not going to build all of them. And you have, let's say you have $1 million. So you have 500,000 here. You have 500,000 here. Well, what ends up happening in this current environment, the stock market has gone down. So your stock market, even though you're still buying and allocating the same way, your stock market has somehow become 45% of your portfolio. And now your bonds and your cash and your other safe investments have now become 55% of your portfolio. And what ends up happening for a lot of us is we're sitting there and we're like, I don't like the way the stock market is looking right now. It's very volatile. It's very uncomfortable. I don't want to put any more money in there. So I'm going to invest more into my 55%. But that is the problem we just mentioned. That ultimately means that you are buying high, that the bonds and the cash and everything, that they are performing the best right now. So you're buying high, and then you're going to end up having to sell low. But we want to buy low and sell high, which I know it feels a little, but the stock market is on sale right now. Now, generally speaking, you would have to have already set up a list, right? That's why you read about Warren Buffett months ago. He had a whole bunch of money in cash. And he had the money in cash because he had a list of the stocks he would buy when they dropped to a certain price. They went on sale. And so this is what you would do. So instead, you would actually buy your next allocation, you would spend an additional 15% in the stock market. And so what you would do is you would end up selling your bonds, which would actually have you what? Selling high. And then you would buy the stocks, which you're right, would have you buying low, which is the goal. That's what we want to do. So when you're rebalancing, then you're back to your 60, 40. Right, so that's the idea of rebalancing. It removes the emotion because the emotion is the stock market has lost $6 trillion straight. I'm not going to do that. But the emotional being removed from it is, the companies that lost money, I thought they were phenomenal companies in December. I thought they were phenomenal companies in January. And I still think they're phenomenal companies in April. Now, as information changes, you'd want to at least consider, like, hey, all right, does that change the thesis of that company? Do I feel less confident in them? But if you're investing in like an index fund in the S&P 500, do you think that all the American companies are basically going to go out of business? And I would say, probably not. So as a result, I would buy more of the S&P 500. I would buy more of the American companies because I know long term they're going to recover. Now, this is naturally an option that works if you have your three buckets where you're okay with the percentage that is in the stock market aggressively allocated because you have the rest of it that you're able to maintain and control for. So you start rebalancing, and then you would just do this. Rebalancing is up to you. You can rebalance once a year. There's people that rebalance once a quarter. There's people that rebalance once every 5 years. They're probably pushing it once every 5 years because your life would have changed so much that you may even have a different allocation by that time. Like you may actually have a completely different life scenario, but that's what rebalancing is. Once a quarter, once a year, once every 2 years, I just look to see how my portfolio is looking, and then I make the adjustment based off of that. All right. Let me see if you have any questions. Are retired 2019. How are you, my friend? He said, I put 3 years of living expenses in the G fund. Okay, 3 years, and that's fine. That is fine. So I'm glad that you already have something that's set aside for you. All right. And then Ronald, he has things to play to follow. Do REITs typically have a higher expense ratio? That's actually a really good question, Ronald. So when you're talking about expense ratios, there are REITs that are almost like index funds where it's like passively managed. Like, hey, look, we have our properties and we're maintaining these properties. We're just sharing the income in a way that's tax efficient for all of us. And we like to generate the money so we can buy new properties. And we may buy one or two every so often. You could have the other version where it's like, we're flipping properties all the time. We're very actively managed. Normally, expense ratio has to do with how actively that fund is managed and how they get paid, right? There's some, unfortunately, let me see if I can even find one. So we'll say index fund for REITs. Because there are some of them where, because they're more actively managed, they charge more fees. And then I've also seen some of them where the way their fees are charged, it's called churning. It just means that they're doing a whole lot of nothing, but they get paid every time they do something. And you'll see those expense ratios that will be like half a bip or something like that. All right, so here's one, right? This is a Vanguard Real Estate Index Fund, Admiral Funds. It has an expense ratio of 0.13, so that would be considered a pretty relatively low expense ratio. You have to have at least 3,000, it says, to place the money in there. And then the real estate, it gives you the year-to-date return. It's not performing as well. They're down to 6%. And then it says the NAV is 2.3 in the expense. And then you look at, let's see here. So it says month in, they're down. 3 months, they were up. Year-to-date, they were up 3. So the 1 year outlook was 9. 3 year outlook, they lost money. 5 years, they're 9. 10 years, they're 4. Since inception, they're at 9%. Right. So then the benchmark, very fancy way of saying, if I compare this to an apples to apples, the average benchmark of REITs inside of the stock market that you can invest in, and they're saying that they're basically on par with what the average performance is. And so that's what they're saying the benchmark is. And they said a real estate spliced index is what they're using as their benchmark. And so you could go through and just find these. Now they do compare the expense ratio and like, hey, look, the average expense ratio of a similar funds is normally over 1%, right? So it's 1.15. And they said we're 1% less than that. So they're like, you got to take that into consideration. And when you're building your own fund, obviously the fees cost something. So you do need to take that into consideration how they're getting paid as well with the performance that you want to keep a track of both of them. But yes, so the expense, you can find one that the expense is relatively the same or low with the rest of them, and then naturally there are some where the expense is higher, but it definitely depends on the fund. Excellent question. Make sure I move that. All right, so let's go back to our case study. So the next thing that we would look at is eliminating debt. So if I'm 10 years out, then debt is going to be one of the big things that I would want to keep an eye on and keep track of. So let me see if we can see what the debt is. So you can see that as far as the debt, we have the mortgage of 150. There we go. We have mortgage of 150,000. We have credit cards about 26,500, and then you have other debt of 5,000. So we would want to be able to put some sort of a plan together to get rid of the debt, and we will do that. So normally there's a couple things that we can do. Let me see if I can find it. Normally, when you're talking about debt, you have a couple of approaches. For the most part, I find that it works equally fine whether you decide it makes the most sense for me. Where is the debt tab? I don't know why. I'm struggling to find it. I think it's on the retirement tab. That's what's throwing me off. So normally when you're working on debt, it generally makes sense for us to simply either list them based off the interest rates, and then you would make the payment on the largest interest rate, or you would take whatever the monthly minimum payments are, and then you would pay the smaller, you put all the extra money towards the smallest, and then you would snowball up and you would move over to the next largest. And the idea is by the time I'm done and I'm basically making a 1,000, 2,000, $3,000 a month payment, and I am struggling to find that. All right, well, it is what it is, right? I wasn't able to find it, but I did tell you just what the two approaches generally are. Man, I'm like, man, it's almost like irking me, right? I'm like, where is it? Because it's here, Dre, and I'm like, I know it's here, but I wasn't able to find it. Now I'll come back. I'll come back to it. I'll come back to it. Yeah, I'll come back to it. All right. So normally when you're paying off debt, I will simply show you what it looks like, and then we can move on. So normally when you're paying off debt, so I think let's say you had like $1,000 here, yeah, $10,000 here, yeah, like 5,000. Let's say my monthly payment is $100, $200, 400 a month. Interest rate 10%, 15, 30%. So there's a couple choices. Number one is you would go based off of the interest rate. I want my money to work in the most efficient way possible. And for my money to work in the most efficient way possible, I need to pay off whatever has the highest interest first. So if I'm going that route, I would pay this one off, then this one, and then this one. If I'm going based off of the minimum payment, so whichever one has the smallest minimum payment, then I would go the opposite order. Both of them are going to work in your favor, right? Either way. And so if you're going to pay the highest interest rate, then you would basically make the minimum payments here and then place whatever your extra amount is on this balance until it's gone. If you go by the minimum payment, then you would say, all right, my smallest one is the one I want to get rid of first. So I'm going to pay the two minimums here, and then I'll put whatever extra I have on this. And then when this account is gone, I then take that 100 and add it to this one. And then when this account is gone, I take the 100 and the 200 and add it to this one. So I'm snowballing to where my money gets paid off quicker. And the idea is, from an emotional standpoint, is you've already committed to making this monthly payment. You just aren't going to change that commitment. Often what happens is as we get rid of one payment, we almost reallocate that money towards something else. But if that is what your debt allocation is, then you should maintain that debt allocation, and it helps your money to start working much more efficiently for you. And so for many people, they would also consider getting rid of their debt by refinancing their mortgage. Now, of course, this depends on what the interest rates are. So if you got an interest rate during the historic lows and you have a 3%, then you probably aren't interested in refinancing in the current environment at a 5%, which is why we have that shortage of houses on the market and inventory, because people are sitting there with a 3%, like, dude, I'm not trying to get a 5% mortgage. But when it flips back, then more people will be interested in selling. And so you can have that option to refinance. Because a lot of people don't want to refinance their first mortgage because they have that, they will often consider getting a second mortgage. And you can either get a traditional, which is just as it sounds. It's like a set mortgage. You get the 30,000 out. It gives you the monthly payment of $200. You pay that for 15 years and then you're done. Or you can get what we refer to as a HELOC, a home equity line of credit. So you open up your HELOC, and it's basically a line of credit, but it's tied to your home. So if you don't pay it, they would take the home. It's tied to the home. It's a collateral loan, and then you would run all your credit cards inside of there. It's going to give you huge cash flow savings, which is just you'll pay a much lower monthly payment. You won't, because of the changes in the last Secure Act 2.0. You won't get the tax deduction on the interest that you normally get when it's a payment on your mortgage, because they only give you that on a HELOC if you spend it on improving the house. You can't use it on the credit cards anymore, but it is something that a lot of people like to have for emergencies, because when an emergency happens, you probably won't get approved for that loan that you need it. So the idea for some people is, I'll just get it approved now, and it'll be sitting there for emergency. And if I need it, I'll activate it. And if I don't, I won't. And so then that's normally something that other people would consider doing. There is definitely a decent amount of risk inside of a HELOC from both the bank and for you as an individual. And I know that there are some banks that stopped offering HELOCs because people, right? Obviously, people, if they keep using them, then it's like they never actually pay off their mortgage, right? Like they always have this mortgage balance. And so as a result, the equity in their home doesn't quite cover it like it normally does. And they don't end up having that safety net, that last cushion of a blanket. And so I know that there's a lot of banks that have stopped offering those kind of because of that, but it is something that you definitely want to think about. So the next thing, and let me take a quick look, see your question. All right, Ronald, good, good, excellent. Glad that was good and cleared up for you. Thank you for the question, my friend. All right, so we have two things left to look at. Two things left. So number one is, if you're 10 years out, we got to have the retirement lifestyle. And then number two, we got to plan for healthcare. That if you want to have a wealthy retirement, then we got to make sure that your healthcare is covered, so you don't have to think about that at all. And so normally when you're talking about the lifestyle, I'll switch you back to our case study. So when you're talking about your lifestyle, we're normally going to be talking about the goals, the things that you want to do in retirement. I am someone who is a goal planner. I love goals. I think it's important. I think it helps you to stay focused on what you ultimately want. And when you know what that dream retirement looks like, it gives you the extra oomph to say no to things in the short term. And so, ideally, we want to list at least 10 things, right? People have been like, look, Trey, I don't have 20, at least 10. And we don't go lower than 10, where every time you have a new goal, you add it. Every time you check off a goal, you add a new one. That we don't want to go below 10. But it'd be great to really sit there and think of 20, 30, 50 of them. I like to think of 50, because what ultimately happens is the first 10 are normally the squeaky wheel. It's the things that are pressing, they're stressing you out. It's the squeaky wheel. But when you really have to dig deep to list the 31st, the 49th item, you're really going to think long and hard about, what would bring me fulfillment now? I got rid of all the burdens, all the stresses. Where would I like to go? Who would I like to meet? What do I want to spend my time doing? And you start thinking really deeply. And so I like to do that, where even if it's not even something that has a financial component to it, I like the idea of thinking really deeply about what would bring me satisfaction, joy, fulfillment in retirement. So for us, we got started. They want to do church donations every single year. It's $10,000, and we have a donor advised fund. All a donor advised fund is if you weren't sure who you want to give it to, then you can basically put the money in a donor advised fund. Yes, we open those up, and then you take the money, and now it's already considered a deduction in your taxes, and then you can figure out who you want to give it to after that. versus doing all the vetting up front. We're like, oh, is this a good person to get? Is this a good fund? Are they a good registered 501c3? Does their mission align with my goals? That can take a lot of work and take a lot of time. So if you have a donor advised fund, you place the money inside of there, you already get the tax deduction. It is considered irrevocable. Very fancy way of saying that you can't take the money back. You have to give it to some charity, but at least you get to the time to now decide what charity I want to give it to. We have our lifestyles. So they want to go on cruises. They were big on like boats and cruises. So they want to take the cruise every single year. It's about $4,000. There was what was that purchase? No, that wasn't it. We ended up moving that over. It made more sense to put it here. And so they had, let me just remove that other one real quick. They were talking about getting a boat for a little bit, and they ultimately decided that they would rather have a boat club membership. So that's where we ended up going. And that was about, I think it was like $500 a month, and it was $2,000 kind of activation and setup fee. And so that's where we get the $8,000 from. Tony is the one that loves the boat, so we're going to go ahead and we'll be able to set that up. Then they have the children in college. They have one, she's 18. They set it up where it's split between the two of them. I think she's going to have a little bit of scholarship, and they're going to donate a little bit of the funds toward it. I always add long-term care. As you know, 7 out of 10 people 65 and older have at least one long-term care episode. And on average, that number is about $50,000, $60,000 a year, and it's about 3 years on average. So we just have that set in there. The way inflation works when you have it the last 2 years of the plan, that $50,000 is $75,000 at that particular point of their retirement. And then we have the just annual healthcare expenses, and that is currently the national average, which is about $6,400. And there's a portion of that goes towards your Medicare payments, a portion of that goes towards your co-pays, your deductibles, and then just your actual overall medical expenses, your prescriptions and things like that. So that would go into consideration for them as well. And then the goal is to retire at 65, a little bit of flexibility if they want to retire earlier. And they believe that they'll be able to have their monthly expenses in retirement lowered to $5,000. So that is right, the goals that we have set early on for them to be able to kind of put the plan together and work things out. You would do the same idea. Where do I want to go? What do I want to do? What would that cost look like? If I want Super Bowl tickets, how much is that? I want to go to the World Series. What does that look like? If I want to support my college and all these different things, what does that look like? And you could even put real estate purchases, business adventures, any of these type of goals. They would go here, and then we will be able to set the number aside. We'd say what year, how much we need, and then we'd adjust it for inflation, which I do think a lot of people overlook. You'll say, oh, I need 50,000, but if you're not increasing that with inflation, then when the day comes, you're going to be underfunded. So you don't want to just sit there and leave it at that. And then the last thing that we'll talk about, and I guess I could talk a little bit here as well. I'll just share with you the taxes. So in this particular one, they did not have anything that was set up in the Roth. They did not have any tax-free income that was being generated. Based on the amount of money that they had, it wasn't something that we were going to immediately be able to just access a Roth. So we had to start doing backdoor Roth conversions. And you can see here that what we ended up doing, pro rata means you take an equal amount out of each of their accounts, and that made the most sense for where their money was allocated. We then withdrew the money, taxable first, tax deferred second, tax-free third. Leave you the tax-free money as long as we can. And then as far as filling out the bracket, anytime their tax bracket was at 24, 20%, we did a Roth conversion for them. So what does that ultimately do for them? I'm glad you asked. That ends up giving them an extra $2 million in their accounts at the end of the plan. They spent $544,000 less in taxes because they didn't have required minimum distributions. They didn't have that taxable ordinary income. And then they also had about $4.4 million that they were able to not have to withdraw, where they maintain their retirement lifestyle, but they did not have Uncle Sam forcing them to take anything out, which you and I would say that is great. And I would agree with you. Now, when you look at the numbers, this is what it would look like. I won't bog you down too much, but basically what we'd do is we would take where their income is, and then we have the amount that we take out of their taxable accounts. We have the amount that we would convert, and then we would then add that to our tax-free bucket over here. And then we would take, then this is their tax-deferred bucket. So this is their tax-deferred. This is their 401k. As you remember seeing, that's where most of their money was at. They had about $800,000 in their 401k. And then we were going to start methodically moving this money into their tax-free account so that they have a lot more tax-free income in retirement and a lot less required minimum distributions, taxes, ordinary income. And so you can see each year we were able to do withdrawals based on the income that they had in the tax brackets that they were in. And you can see that we were reducing how much was in their taxable account. And then you can see we're increasing how much they had of tax-free income. And now instead of having this same taxable income, I mean, it is what it is. You're going to pay taxes on it, but at least it's not in 1 year. Now it's spread over a decade. And if you spread it over those years, it then gives you more and more tax-free income. So that way, when you're 65, now you have nothing in your taxable account, you have nothing in your tax deferred account, and you have all of it in your tax-free account. Right? Like that is the 10-year runway that you give yourself by setting things up early to where you are able to say, we have a tax-free retirement. And then when you do that, that is how you ultimately end up with those numbers that you ended up seeing. That is how you end up with $4.4 million that you don't have to withdraw because you don't have required minimum distributions. Because if it's not that they just had 700,000 in their 401k, is that the money kept growing and they kept contributing the same percentages into that 401k. Now we have probably over $1.5 million, $2 million inside of that account. And now you have those required minimum distributions on that entire amount. And then you have your Social Security that you've activated, and then any other streams of income, if you have them, then they're just stacking on top of each other. So we're able to do that for them. All right, and then the very last thing from a healthcare perspective, let me see if I can turn us to that real quick, and then we'll be all done. And then if you have any final questions, I'll take them, and then we'll be good to go. So when it comes to Medicare, normally the way that we would consider it is, do I plan on spending most of my time where I'm at, right? At my home, or am I going to be traveling? And if you're traveling, that will change which Medicare plan you would have. So normally you'd have the original Medicare, parts A and B, and then normally Medicare Part D, the prescription plan. And then you also have the ability to have Medigap, and that's going to cover some of the gaps, or it just says its name, the Medigap plan. And they will put caps on things like your deductibles and your co-insurance and out-of-pockets. If you're someone that likes stability and certainty, then you might consider the Medigap plan. And then the last one would be if you want the Medicare Advantage, or sometimes referred to as Medicare Part C. The Medicare Part C in the prescription drug plan, that is one where you basically are paying it just like your normal stuff, where it's the set amount, it covers everything, and then you would know based off of the lifestyle that you have. So you see your Medicare Advantage with prescription drugs, it covers your hospital insurance, medical insurance, and prescription drugs. And then you need to work with doctors in network of your residence, but you can't see doctors outside. You have to pay a little bit extra. And then these plans often cover the dental and vision, which is what a lot of people are looking for. So normally you would go through your three choices. Do I need them, as far as the being in network and the deductible copay, if that's important or not important for me, and then my out-of-pockets. So if you're someone who, right, I prefer more predictable cost with an out-of-pocket limit, then the Medicare plan is going to be good for you. If you're someone who says, I'm healthy and I can work with a deductible copay insurance for lower premiums, great. Then if you're healthy, then that would be something for you. And I spend most of my time at home in network, you'd be fine. If you change it, where you're like, hey, I travel a lot of snowbird, then you see the Medicare Advantage, Medicare Part C necessarily wouldn't be the plan for you because it's in network to get those benefits. If you're always out of network, then you're going to be paying some out of network fees, and it may not make sense for you anymore. Right. And so if that was the situation for you, then you would consider the Medigap plan. They have a little bit more flexibility on the doctor choices, but you have lost the idea of a low, no deductible copay, right? So you have to be like, hey, look, I see my doctor frequently and I have concerns about my copay deductibles adding up. Great. Then the Medigap plan's for you because it puts the cap on it. So you won't have to pay as much out of pocket because it puts limits on it. And then you have I prefer more predictable income. Of course, you have that option for you. And then less predictable, right? It's all good, they said. And then the very last one, if you have Medicare Part A and B, then that one would be tough for you if you see your doctor frequently because you're going to pay the deductible and copay all the time. So you generally would be a healthy person who feels like, I'm not going to go to the doctor that much. So every once so off, I'll go. It's not a big deal. If that's the way you feel, then there's no reason to pay that monthly amount to protect yourself against that. And then it would be something for you just to ultimately decide. And as you can see, The original Medicare A, B, and D, they don't have the you have the flexibility of doctor, so it doesn't matter if you want to stay home or travel, and then your out of pockets, right? If you prefer more predictable, then your normal one is not going to be more predictable. You don't know what the co-insurance is going to be. You don't know how much your out of pocket deductibles are, and you don't know all those different things are deductibles and stuff because there's no caps, there's no Medigap, there's no Medicare Part C, and so these are all things you would consider. Normally, when you're given tips, there's a handful of things that I mentioned, and we'll go over them, and then we'll be all done with our Q&A. At least we'll end with that. So if you're turning 65, Medicare enrollment is not automatic. We always remind people of that. So if our group retiree benefit or COBRA, right, you can still need Medicare. If you miss your enrollment period, there is a lifetime penalty. And so if you don't enroll in Medicare, there's a monthly income amount that they add onto your monthly payment, and that's for the rest of your life. And so that is just going to be something that you would have to deal with. And that's why it's ideal to make sure you have everything set up. If you enrolled in Medicare, that stops your contributions to your HSA. They just don't talk to each other. They're just not friends for some reason. And I enrolled in the Medicare Advantage, then you don't need the Medigap. And then what's my total healthcare cost? And then as we just went over, it varies by plan, but it does range about $5,000 to $8,000 per year. And this particular plan, the national average ended up being about $6,000 per year. And so those would be the last things that you'd want to consider. Outside of the financial perspective of it, you do consider the health, right? If I eat right, if I walk periodically, if I meditate, if I, all these different things that you and I know, manage my stress levels, be out in nature, all these little things increase the likelihood of me being healthy, which decreases my healthcare expenses. All right. So let's close out with any final questions. Ronald, great showing. Draw the mic, Dre. I appreciate you, Ronald. I do. Thank you so much for hanging out. It was a lot of information. Hopefully it all made sense for everybody there. I do enjoy it a lot, and so I'm thankful. Now, definitely trying to do. The reason I started the live is because I think we're all sort of feeling the same way. Where this AI stuff, I can't tell what's real and not anymore. There's people I would listen to, like I listen to Jim Rome a lot. And I would go on YouTube and I listen to someone. I'm like, that's not Jim, because I listen to him so much. I know the stuff he would say, and I'm like, it sounds like him, but that's not him. And I'm like, man, that's really tough. Like, imagine if you're trying to do that, you as well. So I was like, how about I do a weekly live? I go out, I walk through the stuff. You can see it's me. It's not AI generated. I'm not reading a teleprompter. We're just going through the stuff. And so that way it gives you a little bit of certainty, a little bit of comfort. And so I'm glad that you came out and enjoyed it. All right. And I do believe that is it. If you are interested in going further with me, I do invite you to go to obsidianwisdom.com/wealthy. And then you can get on my calendar and we can go from there. As always, I'm thankful for our time. Until next time, stay safe and enjoy life.